It was a hot summer day in July 1944, within the confines of a classified research laboratory in Maryland, when the air suddenly became unbreathable. A chemist, working on a project of the utmost secrecy, had simply unscrewed the cap of a small lead tube. In an instant, the room was overwhelmed by a stench so profound and aggressive that it defied simple description. It was a cacophony of olfactory horror, a precise, chemically engineered blend of rotting flesh, raw sewage, skunk spray, and rancid vomit. The reaction was immediate and visceral. The chemist stumbled back, gagging violently, but the damage was already done. The volatile molecules had not merely entered his nose, they had seemingly bonded to his existence, seeping into the fibers of his clothing, his hair, and the pores of his skin. While his colleagues scrambled to evacuate the building, unable to tolerate the atmosphere for even a second longer, the chemist was left with the realization that he would carry this badge of dishonor for days. A subsequent memo regarding the incident noted dryly that testers found it physically impossible to remain in the room. This was not a simple accident. It was a demonstration of what was intended to be America's psychological superweapon against the Third Reich. This was Humiliate, a spray designed to be so foul that it could dismantle the dignity of a Nazi officer in a heartbeat. The logic behind the project was rooted in a sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare. By 1943, Allied intelligence agencies, specifically the American Office of Strategic Services, OSS, and the British Special Operations Executive, SOE, had identified a gap in their arsenal. They had plenty of ways to kill the enemy. Explosives, silenced pistols, poisons, and incendiary devices were in ample supply. However, they lacked a method to humiliate the enemy, to undermine the terrifying aura of the German military machine without firing a shot. In occupied territories like France, the Netherlands, and Norway, the power of the Wehrmacht relied heavily on the projection of superiority. German officers patrolled the streets in immaculate field gray uniforms, projecting an image of iron discipline and untouchability. They were the masters of Europe, and the local populations watched them with a mixture of fear and hatred. The OSS posited a unique theory. If you could shatter that image of perfection, you could shatter their authority. A German commander shouting orders while smelling of fresh excrement would not inspire terror. He would inspire revulsion and, more importantly, laughter. If the resistance could turn the occupiers into walking punchlines, the psychological grip of the Nazi regime would begin to loosen. To achieve this, the OSS turned to science. They needed a smell that was not just bad, but universally, biologically intolerable. The project, officially designated as the SAC, 23 Contaminated Stench, was handed to the Arthur D. Little Company in Boston. The man spearheading the formula's creation was Ernest Crocker, a chemical engineer and MIT graduate who was known in the industry as the man with the $1 million nose. Crocker was a pioneer in the field of odor classification, having developed systems for categorizing smells decades earlier. He approached the problem of creating the ultimate stink bomb with the same rigor one might apply to building a bridge or synthesizing a cure for a disease. His philosophy was that a bad smell was simply a weed among plants, matter out of place. But to create a weapon, he needed something that transcended cultural preferences. While food and perfume preferences varied wildly between a Parisian socialite and a Bavarian soldier, the biological revulsion to human waste and decay was a universal survival mechanism, hardwired into the human brain to prevent disease. Crocker and his team developed a formula that was nothing short of a chemical masterpiece of misery. It was a cocktail of 5 specific compounds, each chosen to target a different aspect of human disgust. The primary ingredient was scatol, or 3-methylindole, the compound responsible for the true, repulsive odor of human feces. The human nose is evolved to detect scatol at incredibly low concentrations, signaling immediate contamination. To this, Crocker added amyl mercaptan, a sulfur-heavy compound that mimics the eye-watering spray of a skunk. Butyric acid was introduced to provide the sickeningly sweet and sour notes of vomit and rancid butter. Valeric acid contributed the sharp, acrid scent of sweaty feet and body odor. Finally, capric acid rounded out the bouquet with a goaty, barnyard animal stench. Together, these chemicals created a sensory assault that was overwhelming. But the genius, and the curse, of the formula lay in its persistence. The chemists utilized lipophilic compounds, molecules that were attracted to fats and oils. This meant that once the spray hit a wool uniform or human skin, the sulfur-containing mercaptans would chemically bond with the proteins. It wouldn't just sit on the surface, it would become part of the target. The specifications demanded the smell persist for at least 2 hours at 70 degrees Fahrenheit and survive attempts at washing or dry cleaning. There was also a secondary, more controversial aspect to the development of the weapon. Intelligence planners, operating under the racial prejudices and limited cultural understanding of the 1940s, believed that a different formula might be required for the Pacific theater. OSS reports suggested, based on the widespread use of human waste as night soil or fertilizer in Asian agriculture, that Japanese soldiers might be desensitized to fecal odors. Whether this was based on any legitimate physiological science or merely racist speculation is a matter of historical debate, but the result was a modified Japanese formula. For this version, Crocker replaced some of the fecal-smelling scatol with alphoinone, a compound that introduced the nauseating, sweet smell of rotting corpses. The intent was to find a scent that would trigger a visceral reaction even in those theoretically accustomed to bad smells. The OSS was leaving nothing to chance, attempting to tailor their chemical warfare to the specific cultural psychologies of their enemies. The project was championed by Stanley P. Lovell, the head of the OSS Research and Development Branch. Lovell was a figure of immense creativity and moral flexibility, referred to by OSS Director William Wild Bill Donovan as Professor Moriarty, a nod to the criminal mastermind in Sherlock Holmes stories. Lovell's department was a workshop of horrors and wonders, producing everything from explosive coal meant to destroy locomotives to suicide pills for captured agents. He viewed the humiliating, stench weapon as a vital tool for the resistance, envisioning French teenagers slipping through crowds to spray a squirt of liquid humiliation onto the trousers of a Gestapo officer before vanishing into the crowd. The officer, suddenly reeking of feces, would be ostracized by his peers and laughed at by the locals. It was a perfect scenario on paper. However, as the project moved from the laboratory to the field, the realities of physics began to dismantle Lovell's vision. The fundamental problem that plagued the humiliating project was the delivery system. The very properties that made the chemicals effective as a stench weapon, their volatility, their ability to disperse rapidly in the air, and their low molecular weight, made them nearly impossible to contain. The molecules were so small and energetic that they seeped through rubber gaskets and corroded metal caps. Early prototypes used crushable glass ampoules, similar to smelling salts, but these were too fragile for the rough conditions of field operations. If a glass tube shattered in an agent's pocket, the agent became the target. The OSS then moved to lead squeeze tubes, but the issue persisted. Technicians at the Maryland research laboratories began to dread their work. The smell permeated the facility, clinging to the walls and the staff. People had to leave work early because their presence was physically nauseating to their coworkers. The smell followed them home, ruining their personal lives and marking them as pariahs. Field testing confirmed the disaster. Major John Jeff of the OSS conducted a series of trials in July 1944 that produced a damning report. Upon receiving a shipment of the tubes, he found that 12% were already leaking before the crate was even fully unpacked. When he subjected apparently intact tubes to a heat test, simulating the storage conditions of a warm warehouse or a pocket in summer, every single one of them began to ooze the foul liquid. But the most damning statistic came from the operational trials. The backfire rate was approximately 33%. In 1 out of every 3 attempts to use the spray, the operator ended up getting the liquid on their own hands. Because of the lipophilic nature of the chemicals, the smell would not wash off. The resistance fighter would effectively be painting a target on their own back, smelling worse than the Nazi they were trying to humiliate. Despite these catastrophic failures, the momentum of the war machine pushed the project forward. 600 units were manufactured and shipped to Paris in early 1945, but by then, the writing was on the wall. The war was ending, and the weapon was a liability. Not a single unit was ever used operationally. The story of French resistance fighters embarrassing Nazis with stink bombs is, in reality, a myth, a conflation of a weapon that existed and a plan that was never executed. While the Americans were floundering with their high-tech chemical spray, their British counterparts in the Special Operations Executive, SOE, were taking a completely different approach to the same problem. They, too, wanted to harass and demoralize the German forces, but they bypassed the complex chemistry of volatile liquids in favor of something ancient, simple, and solid: itching powder. This was not the mild irritant found in novelty shops. This was a military-grade torment derived from the tropical plant Mucuna pruriens, known variously as cowhage or velvet bean. The seed pods of this plant are coated in thousands of microscopic spicules, tiny, barbed hairs only a few millimeters long. When these spicules contact human skin, they don't just sit there, they penetrate the epidermis. The hairs contain a proteolytic enzyme called mucinin, which triggers a dual response of intense pain and unbearable itching. Victims of exposure described the sensation as feeling like their skin was on fire while insects crawled underneath it. The irritation was so severe it could persist for days, often requiring medical intervention. The genius of the British solution lay not in the substance itself, but in the delivery method. The Americans had failed because they tried to create a weapon that had to be carried and deployed by an individual in a high-stress environment. The SOE, conversely, realized they didn't need to get close to the target at all. They weaponized the supply chain. The itching powder was a stable solid. It didn't leak, it didn't smell, and it didn't corrode its container. It could be stored in envelopes, boxes, or jars for months without losing potency. Resistance agents infiltrated the logistical networks of the German military. They targeted laundries that washed Wehrmacht uniforms, clothing factories that produced underwear, and the postal service that delivered mail to the front lines. The powder was dusted into the seams of trousers, the insides of socks, and the fabric of undergarments. It would sit there, invisible and inert, waiting for a German soldier to get dressed. The results of the British operation were staggering and well documented. In October 1943, the SOE sent a report directly to Prime Minister Winston Churchill detailing their success. They estimated that 25,000 Kriegsmarine uniforms had been contaminated at the source. This wasn't just a minor nuisance, it was a strategic disruption. Intelligence reports suggested that at least one German U-boat had to abort its patrol and return to port because the crew was incapacitated. Imagine the scene inside a submarine, a confined, sweaty metal tube where the entire crew suddenly breaks out in an agonizing, unexplainable itch. The medical officer would find no rash, no bug bites, and no sign of infection. The psychological stress of the unknown disease, combined with the physical inability to focus on complex machinery, rendered the boat non-operational. The British had effectively taken a submarine out of the war with a handful of plant dust. The creativity of the resistance knew no bounds when it came to the powder. In Norway, resistance fighters gained access to stocks of condoms destined for German troops and dusted them with the mucuna powder. The result was a wave of German soldiers hospitalized with severe genital irritation that defied medical diagnosis. The humiliation and confusion caused by this were absolute. In France, agents targeted a laundry facility used by the Gestapo, ensuring that the secret police spent weeks scratching themselves bloody, distracted, and miserable, while fearing they had contracted a new biological plague. In Sweden, the SOE office intercepted letters from neutral citizens writing to relatives in Germany, carefully opened the envelopes, added the powder, and resealed them. The German postal system then became the delivery vector, carrying the weapon directly into the homes and barracks of the enemy. Unlike the American stink spray, which marked the attacker, the itching powder was the perfect silent weapon. The victims never suspected sabotage. They blamed allergies, lice, or unknown skin diseases. The SOE did not stop at itching powder. They applied the same philosophy of supply chain contamination to other substances. They utilized croton oil, a violently powerful laxative derived from the seeds of croton tiglium. This tasteless, odorless oil was slipped into food supplies, specifically targeting U-boat crews and barracks. The effects were explosive and uncontrollable gastrointestinal distress. For a submarine crew, this was a nightmare scenario. Submerged and unable to vent the air, a crew struck by mass dysentery was not only combat ineffective, but living in a hellscape of their own making. The British approach was brutal, unglamorous, and undeniably effective. They understood that the goal was not to make a scientific breakthrough, but to make the enemy suffer, and the simplest way to do that was to attack their basic bodily functions through the clothes they wore and the food they ate. The contrast between the American Humiliate project and the British itching powder campaign offers a profound lesson in engineering and warfare. The Americans failed because they over-engineered the chemical agent while underestimating the physical constraints of the real world. They created a smell that was too potent to be contained, ignoring the fact that a weapon that hurts the user is worse than no weapon at all. They were seduced by the cleverness of the chemistry, the specific notes of vomit and goat, and forgot the practicality of the delivery. The Humiliate spray became a footnote in history, a fiasco admitted by the OSS officers themselves, and a source of amusement for historians. Stanley Lovell, in his later memoirs, dismissed it as comic relief, a way to distance himself from the failure. The British, on the other hand, succeeded because they prioritized the delivery mechanism over the sophistication of the agent. They didn't invent a new molecule. They took a plant that had existed for millions of years and found a way to put it where the enemy lived. They understood that unconventional warfare is about logistics as much as it is about psychology. The itching powder worked because it was stable, safe for the operator to handle with basic precautions, and invisible to the target until it was too late. While the Americans were trying to manufacture a million-dollar smell that never saw action, the British were actively hospitalizing thousands of German troops with penny packet dust. The operational impact was tangible. Submarines returned to port, Gestapo operations were disrupted, and morale was eroded by the fear of invisible afflictions. Ultimately, the story of these two weapons serves as a corrective to the often romanticized view of secret gadgets in World War II. We tend to focus on the spectacular failures or the high-tech wonders, but the most effective tools were often the grimmest and most pragmatic. The Humiliate stink bomb remains a fascinating story of scientific hubris, a weapon that theoretically should have worked but failed the basic test of reality. The itching powder remains a testament to the effectiveness of low-tech sabotage. The next time a story circulates about resistance fighters heroically spraying Nazis with stink bombs, it is worth remembering the truth. The stink bomb was a disaster that sat in a warehouse. The real weapon was the itch that drove the Wehrmacht mad, delivered not by a daring agent in a trench coat, but by a laundry worker silently dusting a uniform, or a postal worker slipping a pinch of powder into an envelope. That was the true face of the secret war: quiet, brutal, and relentlessly effective.